The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. Now Jesus and his disciples left from there and began a journey through Galilee, but he did not wish anyone to know about it. He was teaching his disciples and he was telling them, the Son of Man is to be handed over to men and they will kill him. And 3 days after his death, the Son of Man will rise. But they didn't understand what he was saying, and they were afraid to question him. They came to Capernaum, and once inside the house, Jesus began to ask them, What were you arguing about on your way? They remained silent. They had been discussing among themselves in the way which one of them was the greatest. Then he sat down and he called the 12, and he said to them, If anyone wishes to be first, they shall be the last of all. They shall be the servant of all. And then taking a child, he placed it in their midst, and putting his arms around the child, he said to them, Whoever receives one child such as this in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives not just me, but the one who sent me. The Gospel of the Lord. Amen. We pick up today where we left off last week, and we continue our historical romp through the ecclesiastical history. And as Mark Twain once says, history may not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And today we've got an incredible rhythm of going back and forth and back and forth. And I start with the story of the Jewish rabbi and the Catholic priest who were discussing the structures of the various churches. And the rabbi says, well, how high can you go in the Catholic Church? And the priest says, well, the priests are ordained and they're set apart. They're a little bit higher than the other people, than the lay people. He says, is that it? He says, no. Among the priests, they can get a bishop, and the bishop is in charge of a whole diocese, and that's a little bit higher. And he says, is that it? And he says, no. Among the bishops, they elect what are called cardinals. And cardinals mean cardo, or the hinges, and they are the ones who elect the one who is the highest. He says, is that it? He said, no. No, we have a pope, and he is as high as you can go. And the rabbi says, is that it? And the priest says, what do you want, Jesus Christ? And he says, yeah, one of our boys made it. That is the model of the church in many, many people's minds. It is that pyramid with this broad base of lay people, and then maybe the religious, and then maybe the priests and the deacons, and up to Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ is the head of the church, and that's true. However, it is not the model of the Bible. And it's not the model, certainly, of the Gospels. Certainly not the model of the Gospel that we're hearing today. As a matter of fact, Jesus is preaching just the opposite of what that model suggests. He's saying, you want to get to the top, you got to go down. Now, Jesus did not come to form a church. And I think if we have any sense of history at all, we understand that he came to reform Judaism. Because they were really good at straining the gnat and swallowing the camel. They were really good at following the jots and the tittles of the law, but missing the greater power of what the law was telling us to do and loving our neighbors. So he came to completely reform it. He says, and the way you do, and when you do that, they're going to go after you. They're going to get you. And he knew that. He knew that. He said, the Son of Man is going to be handed over, and he's going to be crucified and killed, but that's not the end of the story, because as you go down in the mystery of the divine. He knew the divine, he knew his Father, and he knew he couldn't die, and because love never dies, and the Son of Man will rise on the third day. And the disciples are going, what? What in the world are you talking about? As a matter of fact, they don't get it at all. And in the Gospel of Mark, I think the disciples get it one time when Jesus looks around and he says, who is my mother and my brothers and sisters? And he looks at the disciples and says, these are the ones. But after that, they don't understand a thing that Jesus is talking about until the very end. And then I'm not even quite sure, because there are two endings to the Gospel of Mark. And so the disciples are walking along, And whatever he is saying is going right over their head, because he's saying, you want to go upwards, you got to go downwards. It is downward mobility that you seek. And they're arguing. And what are they arguing about? Well, St. James has got it down cold. We heard in the second reading today, James said, now where does jealousy and selfish ambition, wherever that exists, there's going to be disorder. There's going to be every kind of foul practice. There's going to be hatred and arguments and all kinds of stuff. And so when they get into the house, after Jesus is giving this teaching, he says, notice you guys are fighting. What are you fighting about? And it had to be utterly exasperating to Jesus, because what they were fighting about was who was number one. Who's going to sit at your right and your left when you come into your kingdom, Jesus? And they're fighting because they are all jockeying for positions and they want to be the greatest. Who's going to be the greatest? And you can almost see Jesus pulling his hair out, saying, you just don't understand what I've been trying to not just teach you, but show you by what I've been doing for the last 3 years. Now between the downward mobility of Jesus and the upward mobility of the apostles, and then I dare say every human being, upward mobility is always going to rear its head, because we want to be someone, and we still think that to be someone means to climb the ladder of success. Thomas Merton once says, we spend all of our life climbing the ladder of success, and then we get to the top and we realize we got it against the wrong wall. But you're going to climb. We're going to climb. And I dare say for the first 300 years, Jesus' message did seem to work. As long as they were really the minority report, they were going to work. But as I said last week, that worked for about 300 years. Because after the peace of Constantine, after Constantine declared it as the official religion, we then became a really strong, structured institution. And in that institution, there was going to be a hierarchy. And that's necessary. I mean, that's gonna, and we talked about that's absolutely necessary. But within that hierarchy, the same thing that befell the Pharisees and the scribes of Jesus' time is now falling to the hierarchy of the church. But the structure is necessary. For if the charism is going to go beyond the leader, it's got to be institutionalized, and that's just a fact. You're always going to create some kind of an institution. And within that institution, there's always going to be corruption. Because within that institution, there's always going to be those who are seeking the higher place, the higher ground. Until we get to the time of Luther, as we discussed last week, who said, we need to reform this. And so there was this great Reformation. Luther did exactly what Jesus did. Luther was doing it to his church. He had no desire at all to form a Lutheran church. He wanted to reform the church that he knew. That was it. And of course, then later on, there was the Counter-Reformation, which we're going to skip a whole bunch of history and come right up to our times. Well, at least my time, 1950. Yeah, I was born in 1944, so by 1950, 1952, 1955, I had some sense of who I was as a good little Catholic boy. And back in the 50s, the structure was just magnificent. God was in his heaven. Everything was right for the world. I knew exactly who I was, where I was supposed to be. I was a little altar boy, intro ibo ad altare Dei, ad Deum qui laetificat juventutem meum, and I rang the bells and I lifted up. I had no clue what I was doing. But it was okay, because I was part of the group. Great Catholic identity. And great Catholic identity came from knowing who I wasn't. A public. Worse yet, a Protestant. And as long as I belonged to, and we were a powerful minority. I mean, we really were. And you can go on any block in Chicago, and if you were Lithuanian, you went to the Lithuanian church, or Polish, you went to the Polish church. And everyone just thought they were just the greatest church. The Italian church, of course, the Irish knew that they were the greatest church by far. They spoke the language, they were going. They're going to do it. But when you talk identity, today we're talking about identity politics, you talk identity religion, we had it in spades. And the churches were full. They were. And the seminaries were full, and the convents were full. You know, as a high school student, I was an altar server here at some of the first vows of those who were coming in. The place was packed. And then something happened. Because we were so hooked on our personal salvation, we were beginning to miss what possibly could happen. And we would have never, ever guessed in 1958, when Pius XII died, what was about to happen. A revolution was about to happen, because this little old fat man named John the 23rd was elevated to the highest throne. And he says, you know what? Church is doing really well. Let's open the windows. Let's get a little fresh air in here. Let's see if we can go out to the world. Let's see if we can. And the model of the church was beginning to change. He called in all of the theologians who have been preparing for him. And of course, he was not supposed to be here very long. He was supposed to die in 2 or 3 years. And as a matter of fact, he died very, very quickly. But he wasn't supposed to call a council. That was the last thing anybody wanted to do, because he was going to upset an apple cart. And Octaviani and the boys and the Curia were not very happy campers with what this little fat man was doing, because this is the first council that wasn't defining the church over and against the enemy. Every other council up to Vatican II said the last line of what the heresy was, whatever heresy they were condemning at the time, was anathema sit, which could be translated, go to hell. Yeah, go to hell. You guys, because we know who we are. We've got the truth. We are the Holy Roman Apostolic Church. We are the bride of Christ. And John says, yeah, but there's room at the table for everyone. And he knew what Jesus' greatest desire was. His desire was that all may be one. And so the whole ecclesiology of the church began to change. Now, this is the time that I would imagine, looking at the congregation here, most of us came of age. Yeah? We are Vatican II people. We came of age during that period when the doors were opened, and the model of the church wasn't a pyramid. It was the circle. It was the people of God, and in the center was the Christ. And we were called to relate to each other. And the book that we were all reading at the time was called The Council, Reform, and Reunion. What was the goal? That all might be one. Hans Kung wrote that book, and in that book it was saying that someday if we saw the heretics, because they weren't heretics anymore, you know, prior to that time, if you were going to marry someone who wasn't Catholic, you were in what's called a mixed marriage. And in a mixed marriage, you had to get married in the rectory. Now at the council, they were separated brethren. Now what happens when those doors are open and we had our identity, by contrasting and comparing, our identity begins to get a little bit weaker. We're not so quite sure. Maybe I can identify with a bigger, broader spectrum. And we really believe that that's the gospel. But what began happening is, if everything was okay and everybody had the truth and everybody had a little piece of the action, then maybe our action wasn't so great at all. And the convents began emptying, and the seminaries began emptying, and the church began changing. For every action, there's a reaction. For every action, there's always a reaction. And what was the reaction? We were over and against the Protestants as a minority. The reaction that we had came in 1978, 79, when John Paul II became the Pope. And there was a reaction to what they called it at the end of John's reign, the reform of the reform. What did it mean? It meant that we're going back to what it means to be a church, have some pride in ourselves. As a matter of fact, the seminarians at that point, we call ourselves Vatican II people. The young young priest during the time of John Paul II called themselves JP2 priests, John Paul II priests. Now, what was he trying to do? He was trying to get that identity back that seemed to be lost. And of course, in that process, he came down some pretty hard, and we became a whole lot more rigid. And when Paul VI was granting so many wonderful dispensations, especially with priests who had left and decided to get married, John Paul II says, you can't do that anymore. Well, when all of a sudden, those who were married outside the church or divorced found themselves completely cut off from the church, they were continued to be cut off from the church. For every action, there's a reaction. Benedict continued what John Paul II started, but who would have ever guessed? Who would have ever guessed that there would be a Francis? That there would be a Francis? There is. It still boggles my mind. But Francis was going to have some pushback. You know, when Francis came, there was a saying in Rome that the moment you became a cardinal, you had it made because you were going to have a wonderful palatial estate and you were going to get your Mercedes and a chauffeur to go along with it. Francis came, and the first thing they said when they were trying to put the Capa Magna on him, he says, "What's that?" And he says, "You're supposed to wear it." He says, "Wear it yourself." Francis went out there and he asked for the people's blessing. Unheard of. Moved into the Casa St. Marta. Everybody else is living in little palaces, and he's living in a common dormitory with other visiting priests. Drove a Fiat. It was a bulletproof Fiat, but it was still a Fiat. And drove them nuts. Because everything's upset. The apple cart's been upset. Let us, we heard in the book of wisdom today, let us beset the just one. He is obnoxious to us. And he sets himself up against our doings. We had it going quite well, thank you very much, and now he's turning everything upside down, and he's telling us that the church is a field hospital. That you got to go out into the fields. Instead of having them come to us, you got to go to them. And our privileges, because rank has its privilege, are being taken away. And he's telling us if we want to be first, we got to be last. Oh my God, what's he saying? It's the gospel. And of course, they're viciously going after Francis. And we don't know how it's going to end. But history rhymes. History rhymes. What did Jesus do in the midst of all of that? I love Jesus' response. He didn't tell the disciples that they were nuts, but he did tell them, here's the pattern. You follow the pattern and you're going to know the fullness of life. You want to be first? You're going to have to be last. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for the many, for everybody, because my goal is that all may be one. Now that's a minority report. That's downward mobility. It's always going to be a minority report. And the only way that you could see it is, well, he used a visual aid. He brought his favorite visual aid, and he took a little kid. Now the little kid that he's taken isn't like one of our little kids who are rolling around in $300 strollers. Now, kids at the time of Jesus had absolutely no rights at all. At all. Now, he took a smelly, snot-nosed, dirty little kid and says, here, you see this kid? This is the bottom. This is how you get in. You receive him, you receive me. And when you receive me, you receive not just me, but the one who sent me. You receive the divine. Now that's, I'm afraid, going to be the minority report for sure for the rest of our lives. But it's okay. It's okay. It's the gospel.